Hello, thank you for your video response. I've taken a look and felt I should respond in kind. So here we go.
First of all, I don't know what your beliefs are exactly. If you've accepted Christianity as your ultimate fundamental belief, or if you deny it, or if you are just in critique of it. If you're an atheist, I'm not sure, but
Well, I considered myself a Christian when I made this video, just asking some honest questions and making some observations, which I didn't have any answers for. But now I probably consider myself an agnostic and a positive non-Yahwist. I think that the evidence has led me to conclude that Yahweh does not exist. So now you know where I'm coming from.
you point out the story about rape in the Old Testament, and about the justification of genocide through Jacob's son. Jacob's sons trying to defend their sister because Jacob was passive and he didn't jump to cast a stone or anything.
I think that's already a bit of an apologetic in order to try to rationalize the actions of Simeon and Levi in this passage, Jacob's passivity. Um, I don't see that implied in the text at all. And even if it was, it doesn't excuse their actions. The text says that they killed all of the men in an entire city. What would you consider that justifiable under any circumstances?
First of all, I'm not sure if you understand the networking or the webbing of the Bible as a whole, meaning I'm talking the Old and New Testaments. I'm not sure if you understand how they both mesh into creating God's whole word. You have to look at it in that sense before you can understand it.
Well, I think that making the assumption that there is this webbing and network between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is a false assumption to begin with. It's possible that this is something that you were told by a pastor or in some evangelical Bible commentary. The problem with that assumption is that the people telling you this have an orthodoxy to defend, and they will do absolutely anything in order to defend it. I think that you're going to miss lots of things reading through these writings if you go in with this assumption that there's a greater network and then superimpose your concept of what that network is supposed to be onto what you're reading, rather than letting the authors speak for themselves and contradict each other if that actually happens.
The Old Testament is obviously the law. It's it's ancient Hebrew law, God's law, and obviously with law comes judgment. So that's the Old Testament. The New Testament is a covenant of grace made via Jesus Christ. The first one was made through Abraham. The second one was made through Jesus Christ, and anyone who accepted him was the inheritance of grace and of salvation.
I can already see the incorrect assumption of this greater network or web coming into play here, because I can already see the assumption that the entire New Testament talks about this new, better covenant of grace, where it actually doesn't. Depending on where you read, particularly the Pauline corpus in the Epistle to the Hebrews, you have this idea presented and elaborated, where if you read something like the Gospel of Matthew, and also I think to an extent the Epistle of James, you're going to get different ideas.
If you rape somebody, you're forced to marry him, or the guy is forced to give a certain amount of money to the father of it. Is more so for the woman's protection, because at that time women didn't work at all. They were solely dependent on a man.
I think that's a bit of a rationalization, because why do you think that the women didn't work? Because the men considered the women to be their property, and because of that they had no opportunity to become educated and to do so. That's why they didn't work, and that's why you had the scenario of a woman being forced to marry her rapist. because the father's property had become sullied, and because of this, the person who did the sullying had to acquire what was now considered damaged goods. And this is written in the Torah.
Now, as far as the genocide goes, about the brothers, getting, being pissed off and going into the land and murdering a bunch of people. Now, I think you're trying to present to this like God approved of that, like if he put the stamp of approval on it and he said, good job. I think if you try to look at it in that way, you're absolutely wrong. That's not how the Bible and the verses went along. It's, it never said that it was an act that was that was looked upon as something benevolent.
I wouldn't necessarily say that the actions of Simeon and Levi were looked upon by God as a moral good, but what I was trying to point out is the inconsistency in God's intervention with mankind in these passages. You have being killed for who knows what reason, and you have Onan being killed because he refused to continue his brother's lineage by being forced to have sex with his sister-in-law. Whereas you have Simeon and Levi who kill all of the men in a city and God does nothing about it. I'm just trying to point out the inequity here.
But obviously we're talking about the book of the law, which is basically a bunch of stories of our human emotions and how we reap what we sow.
Well, recognizing that these are a bunch of stories is a step in the right direction. But I definitely don't get the message that we reap what we sow from the story of the rape of Dinah. Do you? Simeon and Levi kill all of the men in the city, and they're not repaid for their deeds. So I don't see that particular doctrine of retribution coming into play here whatsoever.
Remember, everything that we do are dirty rags to him, so things haven't changed at all in the Old Testament or in the New. He's still the same God. He still is wrathful. He will take vengeance on certain things.
Well, as I mentioned before, whether or not there's a change between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament depends on where you read. You're either going to have the idea that people are still obligated to keep the entire Torah, or that even attempting to keep the Torah is going to cut you off from grace. All depends on where you read. And also, I'm not sure if you can see it, but what you're saying about an angry, vengeful God who needs to take vengeance on people for upsetting some sensibility, mostly as a result of actions which don't directly affect him whatsoever, comes across to me as a bit childish and immature. Wouldn't you agree?
A lot of times it wasn't the prettiest thing ever. It was actually really horrid. A lot of things, like stoning your kids, and we could talk about the issue of that. Obviously, God's standard is high, and we do deserve death for our sin. The wages of sin are death, so we do deserve to be stoned and things like that for our sin.
I'm sorry, are you going to rationalize the stoning of disobedient children? Do you really want to go there right now? Feel free to do so if you'd like.
But obviously back then, you were forgiven through the law. Now we're forgiven through grace and salvation.
Here's the thing that I would like you to try to answer without falling back on something that you studied. Why is there a need which has been created to need forgiveness from some cosmic moral accountant rather than the people whom have actually been offended by our actions? Why is that necessary?
If we implemented that today in society, that if you were adulterous, that you would get stoned to death, I bet you the divorce rate would be a lot less. Now, I'm not saying that's a humanitarian way of going about it, because it's a different context. You know, the consensus of it is a lot different because of the time period that we live in. But remember to take in historical context when you look at the Old Testament.
To close, can you give me an explanation of how historical context makes the stoning of adulterers and the stoning of disobedient children okay, rather than using that as a blanket excuse with no further explanation required? I appreciate a response.